We will begin the first talk by Dr. Graeme Pollock. Welcome, Dr. Samar Basat sir. Can we play the talk by Dr. Graeme Pollock, please?
Thank you to the organisers for the opportunity to speak on adverse reactions and early graft follow-up. I'm sorry I can't be in there in person today, but I do hope that the meeting is going well. In the main, we generally consider that an adverse reaction is unique, and our reporting systems are often predicated on this. In other words, that it's a single donor or a single tissue issue, often predicated that the adverse reaction indeed can be identified by the surgeon, and that the adverse reaction is unlikely to be repeated again in the short term with another patient or another recipient. But from an IBank perspective, we should consider that each adverse event is not an isolated event, and that we should consider it in conjunction with other reported events that may come to us and consider the relevance and significance of those events. In that way, we can actually identify trends that can be acted upon or identify systemic problems that can be corrected in the short term. Adverse reaction reporting systems, whether they're active or passive systems, are notoriously slow responders. Surgeons working independently of one another have no ability in identifying trends and thus have difficulty in identifying that their issue may be related to a systemic problem. For example, whilst primary graft failure is rare, it is not necessarily unexpected, and the reporting from the surgeons is therefore delayed. This delay results in a delay in corrective and preventative actions being implemented and can actually compound a systems issue. To illustrate this, consider this hypothetical graft failure timeline where it's assumed that all failures are related to the same systemic issue within the IBank. The head of the graph represents the day of the transplant being performed, and the end of the bar represents the day an issue is reported to the IBank. However, the white circles illustrate the day an issue might be considered to be significant by the surgeon. Colouring the bars to represent transplants performed by different surgeons highlights the problem of associating seemingly independent events in identifying trends. The purple surgeon here is unaware of the blue surgeon's graft failure, and within the purple surgeon's own practice, two graft failures have presented themselves differently. Early reporting of the issues with the grafts would have identified a trend, although the difficulty for the IBank in this instance is identifying when does an issue become a trend. Is it a percentage of cases over time? Is it similar presentations and the significance of that? Is it the number of cases over time that presents, or is it a group of consecutive instances in a cluster? Whatever the case, in this instance, early identification of trends could have identified the problem, instituted early corrective and preventative action, and potentially avoided any further graft failures. With this in mind, within our IBank, we instituted what's called an early graft follow-up, or GFU system. We send an email to each surgeon 2 to 3 weeks post-operatively asking, are there any issues possibly attributable to the tissue? If the answer is simply a no, which is done by reply email, there is no further action other than recording the no in the cornea's record. If the answer is yes, we institute a follow-up phone call with the surgeon for a review of the tissue, both from a doning and a processing point of view. A 6-week follow-up with the surgeon then follows, where we ask, are there still issues possibly attributable to the tissue? It's important that the 2-week follow-up is not there to identify an adverse reaction, but it's there to identify trends that may be an early warning indicator of a systemic problem. The 6-week telephone follow-up is there to identify a reportable adverse reaction. Of course, the normal adverse reaction reporting system continues to operate within this system. This is some of the data that's been generated over a 12-month period, January to December 2021, from our GFU system. Of the 532 corneas that we followed, you can see that 62 of these we had no response. We actually had no opt-outs during this time. Most of these 62 corneas are actually corneas that were sent overseas. We still have in place a passive adverse reaction reporting system on these corneas, and we haven't received any reports of adverse events, so we're assuming that there's been no issues or problems in that group. Of the 470 corneas that we did receive reports back on, there were a small percentage that had issues. None of these issues were related to any post-operative infections, so we saw no post-operative infections at all, keratitis or endophthalmitis. And all of them related to either dislocations of defects or possible primary graft failures. Upon further investigation, we provided an attribution of the possible cause of the issues. You can see that there were no likely tissue factors involved in any of these. Most of them came under unknown possible cornea, possible donor cornea, possible recipient, possible surgical factors, and a smaller amount of 10 that were definitely attributed to be surgical or recipient factors involved. Notably, most of the issues reported to us related to DSEC procedures. You can see more clearly when the data is graphed the issues that dominated were those of DSEC. By May 2021, actually, we felt that we had a trend occurring here, and we did a thorough investigation to look at if there were any tissue factors involved in this trend, but we found none. Instead, we found that the issues were confined to a small number of surgeons, and that the issue was potentially related to inadequate rinsing of the DSEC donor material prior to transplantation. If we split the reporting periods into two halves of the year, January to June 2021 and July to December 2021, you can see how the awareness of this issue actually changed outcome. So much so that we had no reports of DSEC issues in the second half of the year that couldn't be solely attributed to surgical and recipient factors. We believe that this is a very good example of our GFU reporting system identifying potential trends early, trends that may have otherwise gone unnoticed, being able to identify the problem and correcting the problem to provide better outcomes. So in summary, we believe it's important to understand that each adverse event is not necessarily an isolated event, but it should be investigated in conjunction with other reported events. And we've demonstrated that the Graft follow-up system allows for an early detection of trends and the early corrective and preventative action on those trends to provide a better transplant outcome. Thank you.